Welcome to a new episode of Minds Between Languages. Our guest today is Professor Hanna Risku, who will be talking about the intersections between field, body, and context in translation research. Hello, everybody. What a pleasure to have you here with us in another episode of Minds Between Languages. And the treat is all the greater because we have with us Professor Hanna Risku. Hanna, it's a real pleasure to have you with us here today.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Fantastic. So let's get right to it. We're going to be talking a little bit about the intersections among fieldwork, body, and context in translation studies. And I'd like to pick your brain with some definitions, some conceptualizations of what these terms refer to in the particular context of your work. So let's start with the main overarching question. What is field research?
Well, field research refers to direct observation. So it's in fact a specific type of observational research. So that means that the data is collected in the field, in the natural or authentic everyday settings, work settings, for example, of the participants and their activities. So in the case of translation and interpreting, this can mean that researchers spend extended periods of time sitting with translators in their offices or shadowing interpreters in their booths or courtrooms, hospitals, or wherever they work, or in didactic or pedagogical studies. That would mean following translation and interpreting teachers and learners in universities and other learning situations. So the idea in this kind of research is that the activities carried out by the participants are not assigned to the participants by the researchers, but they are the ones that they would normally carry out without any researcher intervention. So that translating and interpreting and learning and so on, that would occur independently of any research purposes. And of course, there's a vast spectrum of possible approaches to field research, and people use different kinds of data acquisition methods and tools like participant observation. We've done that quite much, interviews, document analysis, but you can also use video recordings, diaries, and so on. And like that ethnographically oriented field research aims to describe the ways of thinking of a specific group of people. That could be like literary translators in a specific area, or a team of translators or project managers. And it's also a good method to study virtual or online communities and practices. And this ethnographic research approach, all those approaches share the fundamental idea of being immersed in the setting and trying to approximate the insider perspective of the participants.
You know, this is, I think it's the first time in this series that we have this particular highly naturalistic, non-interventionist ecological approach. It's like typically what we end up discussing are experimental settings, where you have tasks and manipulation of variables and things like that. When you think about this contrast, right, between this more naturalistic observational approach that field research entails and the more controlled laboratory type setting, what would you say are the advantages and disadvantages of field research relative to this other approach?
Well, field research allows us, in any case, to analyze cognitive processes that are embedded in the relevant environments. And I've noticed that ethnographic and workplace studies are gradually becoming part of this methodological toolkit of cognitive translation and interpreting studies. It enables us to describe translation and interpreting in their social and historical contexts with a very strong connection to the daily work or to day-to-day lives of translators and interpreters, for example. And like ethnographies can show how complex also routine tasks can be, and how much routine there is in complex and creative tasks and activities. When it comes to the study of translation and cognition, I see cognitive ethnography as a particularly advantageous or productive line of research. Cognitive ethnography is that study of cognitive phenomena in context, and it was originally launched by Edwin Hutchins, who's also the father of distributed cognition. He also calls this approach cognitive ecology. And it looks at how people create meanings, how they exploit and manage their resources, and how these meanings and resources are brought to bear in their activities, also in group activities, organizational or institutional decision-making, for example. So by using cognitive ethnography of approach, we can examine how these technical, material, social resources are employed in translation and interpreting. We can study translators and interpreters' work and thinking as interactive processes, look at the moment-to-moment development of translation and interpreting processes, also in their relation to socio-cultural processes. So, and also we can study translation and interpreting on different time scales over the course of just a few minutes or an entire workday, a whole translation project, maybe a month of work in a translation department, or even the developments and changes of some agency or other workplace during many years of activity. And the unit of analysis can also be just one translator or interpreter, for example, in his or her workplace, or a whole network of actors and tools. So, yeah, I think it makes a difference, big difference where and how you study translation and interpreting and cognition, because you learn about different aspects of the cognitive process, depending on whether you study in the lab, in the classroom, or in the field. And in the field, we can study how the tools and the space in which translators and interpreters work, how they shape the cognitive processes. So, for example, how the workspace and the colleagues and the tools become parts of the translator's cognitive processes, and how the booth and other environment shapes the conference interpreters' processes, or maybe how the cognitive processes of community interpreters are aligned and connected with the other speakers' cognitive processes. So it's kind of a common shared space, a common experience. Or even you can look at it as one cognitive system, like Hutchins did. And we can look at how remote interpreters exploit their environmental cues in that digital environment. And of course, that environment can be helpful or irritating or even disruptive to the activity. And also, of course, the lab shapes the cognitive processes. So in the lab, we can study how the cognitive processes are aligned and coupled with the social and material resources that the lab provides, depending on what kind of scaffolds and social and technical scaffolds it offers.
Everything you say resonates so directly with some other approaches which are different in their tradition, their historical trajectory, their concepts, but at the same time so deeply connected with many of the premises you mentioned. I'm thinking in particular about embodied and situated approaches to cognition, and more particularly to cognitive processes during translation and interpreting. Is there a connection between this overarching framework of fieldwork that you just described and this particular lines of work regarding situated and embodied approaches?
Yes, I think when I look at my previous research topics, for example, I think you find this connection in each and every of these projects. Like I started in 2001 looking at one translation agency and looking at their cognitive processes. That was the project managers, translators, and CEOs also working there. And I realized how their work consists of many cognitive tasks that had not really been in the center of translation process research, like tasks like project management with tight deadlines and managing the network of freelance translators, working with technology and so on. And for me, it was working with the situated and embodied cognition approach that helped me understand how their cognitive process was distributed in this network and how it in fact consisted of all the interactions running in parallel. So since then, I have carried two follow-up studies in the same agency. It's a longitudinal study, really spanning a total of 14 years in a translation agency. And I also looked at the cognitive processes of a freelance translator working directly with a customer and studied the transformation of mental processing into interaction with the environment. So also there, it was interesting to uncover the complex network on the side of the translator on the one hand, and on the client on the other side, the customer, and how looking at how those networks shaped and scaffolded, supported the translation process. So also there, it was wonderful to be able to see how the translator offloaded cognitive processes onto environmental affordances. So she did this to be able to remember, to make decisions, to organize herself, to evaluate her own work, and so on. So it was really a prototypical example of extended cognition.
That particular concept is so interesting and so distinct in the sense that many works within cognitive approaches to translation and interpreting, they have this subject-centered focus in the sense that often cognition is defined as what happens within the individual. But this notion of extended cognition that you are describing here really resonates with broader notions in cognitive science, in terms of extended minds, right? So would you describe a little bit more what these extensions, as it were, these notions of extended cognition, extended translation perhaps, what they entail, how they manifest, and whether we can actually talk about a mind that exceeds our bodies?
Okay, wonderful questions. I hope I can answer some of them. So this situated embodied cognition and extended cognition, it's actually a cluster of different approaches. It's also called 4EA cognition: embodied, enacted, extended, embedded, affective cognition. And it emerged in different fields of cognitive science in the 1990s, became a paradigm or cluster like in the turn of the century. And it implies that material, social, neural, physical, cultural aspects of a situation, they are elements of the cognitive process. So they are coupled with and they co-determine each other. This includes this kind of offloading of cognitive processes into the environment that I mentioned earlier. So this situated, extended, embodied cognition approach sets out to explain why and how we exploit and manipulate the environment in cognitive processes. And it's not just that we are embedded in a situation and that the brain is part of the body, but because of course that's also true, but that would be trivial, wouldn't really make any difference for our understanding of cognition. So this situated embodied cognition approach really rejects the picture of cognition as a purely inner process, kind of sandwiched between perception and action. It's rather the idea that perception and action and the neural and bodily interactions with the environment, they co-constitute cognition. And the significance of cognitive processes like remembering, learning, finding your way, and so on, it depends on the fact that these different sensory, motor, neurological processes, they not only happen in parallel, but they really co-determine one another, like one cognitive system. My cognitive approach to translation, which I call extended translation. Of course, it's very much inspired by extended cognition by Clark and Chalmers. But it's not really only an application of this extended cognition approach to translation, because after all, it stems from this tradition of cognitive translation studies and translation process research. So it's kind of my attempt to redefine the object of study for these fields. It's my attempt to extend the understanding of the translation process on several levels or dimensions. First of all, what I also already mentioned, the approach broadens the concept of a cognitive translation process. It's not only a mental process inside the translator's brain, but the body is an integral part, and social and physical interactions and the use of various tools. So the cognitive process extends beyond an individual brain. And also the second extension would be, it signals that translation processes are taken to extend beyond one individual translator. So it also encompasses various other tools and artifacts. So the object of study is extended from individual translators and their cognitive processes to a coupled system of human organisms and other entities. And also, I see it as an extension of our understanding of the translation process in time. So beyond the instance in which somebody is given a source text and somebody starts to read the source text and write the translation. So rather, I think translation processes start much earlier when terminology and guidelines are decided upon, and the terms and conditions of the translation project are negotiated, like language register and tools to be used and so on. So the translation process also extends to at the end also, from not only when the last words are written and revised, but when the client or customer maybe does some revision rounds and checkups and so on. And you also maintain the tools. So that's another extension. And of course, since I very much like to do longitudinal studies, looking at the developments of translation processes and learning and changes through due to new tools and so on, it's also this extension to longitudinal translation process research.
That is very clearly laid out and such an interesting take on it. I was going to ask you about how you account for context, but I think, Hanna, that you gave us a very good idea already of the elements that your conception of context sort of brings together. So let me ask you a slightly different question, which is, given your broad conception of translation and all its extensions in terms of workflow, time, participants, resources, what would you say is the one contextual factor that cognitive translation studies has most notoriously overlooked in its history? Which is the one thing outside our individual mind that you say, you know, this is the one thing that you guys should have been paying attention to all along?
Since technology is already and the tools, the artifacts are already being taken into account in experimental research, that's not really the problem anymore. Maybe it's also kind of the complexity of translation and the situatedness. I think it's still the situatedness in the sense that it really makes a difference, and that context is not a ready-made box that determines our understanding of the situation. So like Lucy Suchman writes that we have to get away from this box-like, container-like connotation of the context. So we need to avoid the misunderstanding that the context would somehow universally and automatically prior to anybody's understanding of the context, determine our understanding and structure the action itself. Because this situation is also in the moment of translation and understanding, it's also being understood in that situation. So when you say that something happens in this and that context, it only means that it happens in relation to relevant elements of that situation. And the relationship between cognition and context is a reflexive one. So context is not a box that has an action independent meaning. And I think that has huge consequences for our understanding of translation processes and cognitive processes. And you really have to very closely look at what is the context for that person in that activity. I think we are still in the process of trying to understand those consequences, those implications.
But that bidirectional conception, I mean, the realization that there's not a unidirectional causal or deterministic relation between context and what you do, but rather that what you are doing in the midst of that contextual scenario also shapes the context and the contextual scenario itself. It's something that I agree. I mean, it's something that should be factored in more deeply in what we do here, and it's something that in other traditions, I'm thinking about certain branches of linguistics, systemic functional linguistics, for example, has been present for a long time. It's very nice to hear these ideas are finding their way into our field here, and this overall framework that you're describing for us, Hannah, not only does it have specific constructs and notions and concepts that seem to be specific to it, but also it gives us the opportunity, I believe, to rethink or reconceptualize some other concepts, or at least terms that have been floating around in more traditional aspects or trends within cognitive translation and interpreting studies. One of them, which I know happens to be of interest to you, is the notion of expertise. So how would you redefine, perhaps, reconceptualize the notion of expertise? Do you think that it would be incumbent on us to think about a new profile for this concept in terms of this very, very rich framework that you're describing?
Yes, expertise and experts, there has been a long discussion about that in translation studies, also cognitive translation studies. And of course, empirical research has mainly been done experimentally. Translators with different levels of expertise have been asked to translate the same text, and they are observed while they are translating the text. And in this way, some very valuable differences between experienced and less experienced translators have been identified. But I think you're right. I think that this research only shows a part of what it means to be an expert. And also there's the problem for the experimental research projects of who to choose as a research participants if you want to take one group as the experts. So we have just started a new project called Rethinking Translation Expertise, a workplace study, or RETRIX for short. And we assume that expertise is actually primarily created in social situations, in interactions with other people. So it means that expertise depends very much on the situation, and there can be very different notions of expertise. And in our project, we want to find out what expertise can be made of in working practice through field research, but also we want to find out which different ideas of translation expertise prevail in the practice, in the field, and how these ideas come about and how they work. For example, who is recognized as an expert and who is not, and why. So we want to shed light on what it means to be a translation expert in the practice in workplaces.
Once you have this, the framework, and you start carrying out research, and you have findings and you have publications, What are the immediate practical implications of this line of work? Do you think that they can inform actual translation practice, a translation pedagogy or didactics? How do you think these emerging notions could actually become translational tools, not in the translation sense of the term, but in the applied sense of the term?
Yes, I've seen that the practical implications seem to be easily communicated. I realized that when I present the results of my research to practitioners, there are always people who say that what we have found reflects precisely what's happening in their workplace. That's also something that field research can do, kind of empowering the participants and the practice. So, for example, we've seen that the companies, translation companies, are expanding their operations and their processes are more and more diversified. The tools become more fragmented. The employees are more specialized, and also the customers, the clients, client base might be more differentiated. We have seen that the clients might feel that they have to constantly monitor external translation and proofreading processes, and they're not quite sure how to do that. The language service providers feel that their expertise is not always accepted. They do not always get the background information, time, and money that they would need. So I think we can, together, we can discuss the ways to overcome such frictions in the field. And as I said, for the participants, I think this kind of ethnographic research, trying to approximate the insider view of the participants, it can really give the participants a voice and describe translation from their perspective. So it can empower them, it can help them understand and manage the overall situation. It might also help the management level to find ways to increase job satisfaction, for example. It can help clients to handle translation and interpreting and multilingualism as a whole in an adequate way. And of course, you mentioned didactic and curriculum development. Yes, I think such deep insights into the translation processes and practices and networks, they enable us to inform students about the today's job opportunities and also to critically reflect on the developments on the job market. So it really, for me, it's essential, and it's also fun to use every opportunity to work in close cooperation with society and keep a finger on the pulse.
That is phenomenal. And if I may take one more minute of your time, Hanna, for a final question. Looking forward, what do you think are the immediate, most outstanding challenges for this line of work you sketched for us?
There are a number of areas that, of course, require further attention. Most studies have focused on written translation, and investigating the interpreting process is coming up now too. Also, ethnographic processes, projects and field research there. That's also important. But of course, there are many other forms of translation and interpreting that have not really been looked at from the cognitive perspective. So there are some studies on audiovisual translation, audio description, for example, but what about game localization, the translation of advertising materials, speech to text interpreting, all these technology supported forms, technology assisted forms of translation and interpreting, new forms of translation and interpreting. That would be really interesting looking there at those. And also, I think one of the challenges, well, you said only one challenge, but I might mention another one, is we have to look at these global supply chains. Translation is carried out in global supply chains. So it's a challenge looking at that empirically, how to study those global translation processes 24/7, empirically, and we need these longitudinal studies also to capture the dynamics of translation processes over time, and understand the consequences also of those global supply chains and network economy for translators and interpreters.
That is fascinating, and not only have you extended certain concepts and approaches within the field. I mean, you've extended the scope of minds between languages with this interview by providing this larger scenario from which and in relation to which we can conceive of translation and interpreting from a cognitive stance. So for that and for all the work you've done, Hanna, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Adolfo, and thanks for your work with this series. Thanks.
My pleasure, absolutely. Till next time.
See you.